Hello, I'm Fred Stella, President of the Interfaith Dialogue Association. Welcome to another edition of Common Threads. Reincarnation. That is a subject that we have not broached on this program for probably well over a decade. And I kind of thought that, well, it's about that time. Recently, an academic paper, actually a journal, came out called Perspectives on Reincarnation, Hindu, Christian, and Scientific. And that led me to thinking, well, we should probably dip our toes back in. And it just so happened that the editor of this academic journal was Dr. Jeffrey Long, who is a friend, a colleague, and someone who knows a little bit about the subject. And when I say a little bit, I mean a whole lot. Dr. Long teaches at Elizabethtown College's Religious Studies Department. He teaches courses on Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, as well as first-year seminar on Star Wars and Asian philosophy. He also teaches Sanskrit, comparative theology, and interfaith engagement. He's the author of 3 books and a wide array of articles on Hinduism, Indian philosophy, and religious pluralism. And he is a consulting editor for Sutra Journal. So we welcome to Common Threads Dr. Jeffrey Long. Hello, Jeffrey.
Hello. Thank you very much for having me.
Certainly. I'm looking at your bio here. I just want to confirm. It says at the end that he also likes cats. I'm assuming we're talking about the animal and not the musical?
Well, I like the musical too, but the animal primarily.
Okay, very good. As do I, as a matter of fact. I got a couple of furries hanging around my house as well. So, Jeffrey, now you are one of those interesting people, not unique, but perhaps, and correct me if I'm wrong, rare. You are an academic. You teach on Hinduism. And you are a practitioner of Hinduism as well, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
That's correct.
This journal, however, which you were kind enough to forward to me in electronic form, this journal is not written just by people who are Hindu or Buddhist or Jain or any other religion that people might associate reincarnation with. It's written by people of a wide variety. I'm assuming there might even be some pure secularists who've contributed to the journal, or not.
Yes, that's correct. There are people who are not of any particular religious background. There are a number of people like myself who are scholar practitioners in Hindu traditions, and there are a few Christian authors also.
And these Christians, would you say that they subscribe to the Orthodox, small o Orthodox understanding of afterlife, resurrection, etc.?
For the most part, yes. For the most part, definitely. One of the pieces by Bradley Malkowski from University of Notre Dame is a critique of the idea of reincarnation, and he's writing from a traditional Catholic perspective. And there's also a piece which is more of a historical piece, but it's about Jesuits in India back in the 1600s who were debating with Hindus on this topic, and it's expressing the kinds of arguments that those Jesuits put forward against the idea of reincarnation. And then, of course, we have articles describing reincarnation from Hindu perspectives, one which gets into Buddhist perspectives, and my own piece is actually an argument for reincarnation. So the idea of the journal was to encompass a wide range of points of view and not to give just one perspective, but to present the argument and the debate that is there across different worldviews on this topic.
And I will say to people listening that this is not for the faint of heart. By that I mean it is an academic journal. This is not something that was written for the general public, right?
That's correct. That's correct. I tend to aim in my work to be as clear as possible. I know academic writing can be intimidating to many, but the primary audience for this was other scholars, and that's reflected in the contents.
Right. And I will say that of the pieces that I read, and I haven't read every single article, but I've read quite a few of them, yours is quite clear. I wouldn't hesitate to give your article to a non-academic. There are some that your head would hurt after the first couple of minutes, especially those people who use Sanskrit terms, assuming that the reader reads Sanskrit.
Right, right, right. I can understand that. I can understand that. And I appreciate the compliment. I teach undergraduates, most of whom have no background at all with India or Hinduism or any of these traditions. So I think that has given me a sense of how to pitch things in a way, present things in a way that is a little more accessible. So I appreciate your saying that. I do aim for clarity in everything that I write, even when I'm writing for a more technical audience.
Sure, sure. So let's get into again. One more thing. I do want to make clear you were the editor and a contributor.
That's correct.
Okay, so we obviously don't have the ability to have every voice that participated in this journal
Right.
here on air. But I suspect you're going to be very unbiased and very fair when we start discussing the issue from other points of view that are different from your own.
I hope so.
Yeah. So let's talk about your point of view.
Okay.
You came to the Hindu Dharma as a teenager. Do I remember correctly?
Well, it was a process. So, which started in my early teenage years, maybe even a little bit preteen, but culminated in my mid-20s when I formally joined the tradition. But I would say that in an informal sense, in terms of holding a worldview and following a spiritual practice, that yes, by my teenage years, I was already well on my way into Hinduism. It was not a quick and sudden change. Like I said, it was a process, probably about a 12-year process. I grew up in the Catholic tradition, and for many years I was sort of trying to reconcile the various perspectives in my mind and still be a good Catholic and hold all of these various views, which are really views associated more with Hinduism. But then by the time I got to college and I studied theology at the University of Notre Dame, a very good Catholic university, and I just realized that what I believed was so incompatible with the mainstream of the church that if I were to try to be a theologian or represent my views in a public way in that context, it really would not work very well. It would not be accepted. And I also was feeling more and more drawn to Hinduism as a community. I met Hindus. I got involved in meditation practice, and I felt very, very comfortable in those satsangs in a way that I no longer felt in my church environment. So it was a gradual process. It wasn't just overnight. But my basic worldview was in place, I would say, probably by high school.
So there was one point in your life where you identified as a Christian,
Yes.
yet maintained a belief in reincarnation.
Correct. That would describe my high school years very well.
And from what I understand, there are a lot of people who would wear that label.
Yes.
Do you have any numbers on that? At least in the United States, people who maintain a Christian, or we could probably also go into Islam and Judaism. But for right now, you have any idea how many people profess a belief in reincarnation yet continue to identify as, say, a Christian?
The figures I have on belief in reincarnation in the U.S. indicate that about 20% of Americans believe in reincarnation, but that's not broken down by religious affiliation. However, if we also look at the fact that the majority of Americans do identify as Christian, I think it's fair to say that a sizable chunk of that 20% would be Christians who believe in reincarnation. And in fact, reincarnation is not a new belief in Christianity. There are many records of cases in the early centuries of the church of figures who clearly professed a belief in reincarnation and did not see any incompatibility between that view and being Christian. It was only around the 5th century or so that the belief was specifically condemned by the church as something that Christians should not accept. But many early Christians did believe in rebirth.
So can you tell us how they were able to rectify the belief in a physical resurrection of one body that would live eternally in heaven with reincarnation?
Well, I think this concept of resurrection has developed a lot through the centuries, and if you look at some of the early Christian writings, it's not immediately obvious that the resurrection of the body necessarily refers to the physical body as we know it today. So one of the early Christian authors who believed in reincarnation, Origen, who is one of the first Christian theologians, he lived around the 2nd century or so. One of the views that is attributed to him is the idea that the resurrected bodies would be spherical in shape, because coming from a Greek cultural perspective, according to Greek philosophy, the sphere is the most perfect shape. So our resurrected form would be a form indicative of a spiritualized perfection, and so they would be spherical. So when Christians today, sort of sitting in the pews, think of the resurrection, they don't typically think of spherical forms rising up into the heavens. They have a far more of an idea of something like this physical body that we inhabit now, but probably in a healthy state, a youthful state. The term that one sometimes sees in Christian theology about the resurrected body is that it will be glorified, and it's not entirely clear what glorified means, but there is definitely a suggestion that it will be free from death and free from any other kind of imperfection. So that particular view is not, again, it's not obvious how that could be reconciled with reincarnation, which is a very different concept, where the soul is dwelling in many bodies, serially over the course of a progression. A body passes away, the soul moves on into another body and another and another. And this resurrection concept might be, if there's an attempt to reconcile the two, like what Origen did, you might see the idea that at the culmination of this process of rebirth, when you attain what Hindus would call moksha or liberation, then the form you inhabit is this perfected, sort of glorified form. But it's not specifically tied with any one physical body that you inhabited during a lifetime. And it's interesting, if you look into Hindu traditions, there are some Hindu texts, for example, in the Vaishnava tradition that talk about how when one achieves moksha, one goes into a heavenly space called Vaikuntha and dwells with Krishna, the personal form of God, for eternity. And the form in which one dwells is a kind of perfected body. So it's not entirely unlike some of the early Christian concepts of what the resurrected body might be like. But it's very different from how Christian theology eventually developed. The Catholic theology, for example, that we know today, it is quite emphatic that it's the same body that one inhabits during one's lifetime is the body that is transformed or glorified or transfigured into the resurrected form. And there's really no room for reincarnation in that particular view. But Christians haven't always held that view. The Christian theology got worked out through centuries of debate, and church councils were held, and the merits of different perspectives were discussed, and eventually the community settled on the perspective which we now define as you said, small o Orthodox Christianity. But that didn't emerge fully from the beginning. It was something that developed gradually. And in fact, we now know from the discoveries at Nag Hammadi in Egypt in the middle of the 20th century that there was great variety within Christianity. If you look at the Gnostic traditions of Christianity, reincarnation was a common belief, as well as a variety of different views of what resurrection would entail and what it would mean, and so on. So out of all that variety and debate, eventually emerges what we know as Christianity. It didn't just spring fully formed from the mouth of Jesus right into the world. It was a long process of debate and discussion.
If you're just joining us, you're listening to Common Threads on WGVU FM. I'm Fred Stella, and with me today is Dr. Jeffrey Long from Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, and we're talking about the religion journal entitled Perspectives on Reincarnation, Hindu, Christian, and Scientific. Now, like all doctrines, clearly reincarnation is not monolithic. You have many different views. Let's discuss some of those. Now, one of the views that is very popular. Now, I'm not saying popular in terms of belief necessarily, but popular in at least people being aware of, is that view of reincarnation where you're walking down the street, you get hit in the head with a brick, and you wake up a mosquito. Juxtapose that to the understanding that if you get hit in the head with that brick, you're going to wake up as a zygote at some point. You know, you're going to be a human being again. Can you talk about those two views?
Sure. Yeah, there are, as you say, there are a variety of views about reincarnation, and even if we just confine ourselves to the Indian traditions, there are a variety of views, and as you say, it's very commonly held in Hinduism, Jainism, and some forms of Buddhism that what we call the soul really has no species. It's not a human phenomenon, that soul is pure consciousness, and every living being has some amount of consciousness. And so, based on that perspective, the soul can take on whatever form is appropriate for its further evolution and growth, or the way that the terminology is usually used in India, based on its karma, based on the effects of its past actions. And so a soul that is in human form in one lifetime could conceivably be taking on a very different form in the next lifetime. And in fact, there's some perspectives according to which human rebirth is a relatively rare thing. And so this is why it's very important to pursue one's spiritual development in human form. Sometimes the question is raised, well, if you believe in rebirth, you might postpone spiritual development. You might say, well, I'm going to have a good time in this life, and then I'll worry about my spirit in the next life. And in response to that, some Hindu traditions will say, well, you might not be human again for a very long time, so you should use the advantages that come with the human form to perform meditation, develop ethically, spiritually, and so on. You have other points of view in the Hindu tradition especially that see reincarnation as very closely tied to an evolutionary process, so that the form that the soul that one's soul takes is part of a long learning process. And on the assumption that the human form has certain advantages that other living forms don't, the idea would be that once you've reached the human form, unless you do something particularly egregious, you're going to continue to be reborn in human form for the remainder of the process. Or in some versions, there are forms even higher than the human form. There are beings called devas in the Indian traditions, sometimes translated as gods, or you can think of them as angelic beings, but they're very highly evolved souls who have very long lifespans and all kinds of powers, and they sort of preside over the world and help other beings on the path. And so in a future existence, one might be in one of those forms also. So there are a variety of views. And then there are some traditions and some perspectives in which, no, you're a human being and that's it, and the soul comes back in human form, and that's all it does. And all of those perspectives exist.
Now, this has been explained to me before, but I would like you to explain it to me now, and do me a favor, talk to me like I'm 6 years old, because otherwise it ain't going to work.
Okay.
All right. So both Buddhism and Hinduism acknowledge the doctrine of reincarnation in a variety of forms, as we just said.
Right.
Okay. The Hindu would say that the soul is that which leaves the body and at some point in the future will take on another body. The Buddhists kind of sort of say the same thing, but they don't use the S word.
Right.
They don't believe in a soul. So if they don't believe in a soul, what is it that was Charlie in one lifetime and Harry in the next?
Okay, well, I hope it's okay if I say something a little controversial, because I think the Buddhist perspective on this has been misunderstood a great deal, even by some Buddhists, and that's the controversial part. I don't want to claim to know more about someone's religion than they know themselves, and they'll have their own interpretation, and that's fine. But I'll say it this way. My understanding of the classical Buddhist position that one finds in Pali and Sanskrit texts from India is not so much that there is no soul as that what we call a soul is actually a process. And the use of the word soul is not recommended according to a Buddhist understanding because it leads us to think of the soul as a thing, as an entity that is changeless and has certain features that are never altered. And from a Buddhist point of view, all phenomena, everything in our experience, including the soul itself, is a process. It is impermanent. It is a flow of discrete, individualized events. So if you think of a motion picture, like the old time, films, now everything's digital, but if you think about like a motion picture reel, it's made up of many, many individual still photographs, which closely resemble but slightly differ from one another. And then when you run them at a high speed, it creates the impression of motion, of movement, and of a singular entity moving from one state of action to the next. And from a Buddhist perspective, when we go deeply into meditation, when we begin to perceive reality the way the Buddha perceived it, it's sort of like slowing down that film reel, and you can see the individual discrete moments that make up the flow of our experience. And so to refer to that whole process as a singular thing, from a Buddhist point of view, it runs the risk of turning the soul into an object, and then when we turn it into an object, we can feel attachment for it. We can have craving for it. And of course, attachment and craving are the root cause of all suffering, according to Buddhism and according to Hindu traditions. So that's why the Buddhists prefer not to use the term soul. But my view is, my interpretation of Buddhism is that it's a misunderstanding to say that Buddhists don't believe in a soul. A soul is as real, or you could say as unreal, as every other object that we perceive. All objects are, in fact, processes, according to Buddhism. When you get down to the microscopic or the subatomic or the quantum level, everything is a flow, it's a vibration, and objecthood is a construct of our mind. And so the Buddhists apply that to the soul as well.
And would you say that, is this similar, in terms of reincarnation, the doctrine of reincarnation, who's closer to whom? The Jains to the Buddhists or the Jains to the Hindus? Or are they in there completely in the left field altogether?
Well, actually, I think they're all quite similar, but they're using terminology in somewhat different ways. I would say I would probably put Hinduism in the middle on that spectrum, with Buddhism on one end and Jainism on the other, because whereas the Buddhists will see the reality of the soul as, to some extent, a construct of the mind, the Jain tradition is quite insistent that the soul is an entity. It even has extent in space. It's almost a material object, you could say. It's not a material object. The Jains distinguish between souls and non-souls. That is what you might call spiritual matter and material matter. But the souls in Jainism actually have an interaction with the physical world in a very direct way. Karma is understood in Jainism, this mysterious force that makes our actions produce like reactions. According to the Jains, this is because karma is an actual physical substance that sticks to the soul. So you could say, whereas the Buddhists tend to see the soul as an abstraction, the Jains are in the other direction of seeing the soul as something very concrete.
Jeffrey, we are close to the wire here at the end of our program, and I realize we said at the beginning that this really remarkable work, I have to say, the journal is called Religion, and it's an academic journal, if people didn't hear us at the beginning. And your series of articles is entitled Perspectives on Reincarnation, Hindu, Christian, and Scientific. And as we mentioned, this is an academic journal written for other academics. If someone is interested in the subject, but not an academic, not a member of the academy, what would you recommend for them to investigate this further? Is there anything you wrote or anybody else?
Well, I have a few articles on this topic. One really accessible work. It doesn't go over the entire breadth and length of different perspectives on reincarnation, but there's some fascinating work on the topic of past life memory by Dr. Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia. And he has published this in a very accessible form in a book called Return to Life. And in fact, I mentioned this in my own article because it really caught my eye when I became aware of his work. And I think that is a good entry point to the topic of reincarnation, because that's where you're getting the scientific perspective that there is this phenomenon of past life memory that is extremely difficult to account for unless something like reincarnation is a real thing.
Well, we will get into that scientific approach next week, Jeffrey, so I hope you can join us then.
Very good. I hope so. Thank you, Fred.
You've been listening to Common Threads here on WGVU. I'm Fred Stella, and with me today has been Dr. Jeffrey Long. He teaches at Elizabethtown College in Pennsylvania, and he is a contributor and editor of the journal Religion, specifically the issue Perspectives on Reincarnation, Hindu, Christian, and Scientific. Please join us again next week here on Common Threads.